Well, welcome everyone to another edition of OTA on the Air. We appreciate you being with us this week. And I'm Tom Balzer, the President and CEO of the Ohio Trucking Association. And with me is Rebecca Brewster, the President and COO of the American Transportation Research Institute. So, Rebecca, welcome to the show. Welcome to being here virtually in Ohio. And why don't you tell us a little bit about ATRI, its history, and what it does?
Absolutely, and thanks for having me on today, Tom. ATRI, the American Transportation Research Institute, is the trucking industry's not-for-profit research organization. We've actually been around since the 1950s, and our focus is pretty simple but clear. Our mission is to do the research that improves the trucking industry's safety and productivity. And in fulfillment of that mission, our research portfolio is quite extensive. We do everything from looking at regulations like the Hours of Service Rules or CSA, to looking at the work environment, looking at congestion, mobility, how to improve transportation infrastructure, to looking at the men and women who work in this industry. So workforce issues, whether it be the driver shortage, driver health and wellness, how to make vehicles safer, how to protect the environment. It really is a very broad portfolio, all in fulfillment of that mission to improve the trucking industry's safety and productivity.
So you've been around for a little over 2 decades now. Talk to us a little bit about what you've seen as far as the impact of the research you've done, whether it be on the industry or in a regulatory nature.
So we reorganized into ATRI. We had previously been the ATA Foundation. We reorganized into ATRI in 2001. And Tom, at that time, we created what we call our Research Advisory Committee, which you know very well because you are a member of that group. And what is particularly compelling about the work of the Research Advisory Committee is they focus on each year identifying the trucking industry's top research needs. And so, as you know, we send out a packet of some 20 to 30 different research proposals, which the RAC members review in great detail, come together in a meeting, evaluate and discuss and deliberate the merits of each of those potential studies, and then vote to come up with the top 6 to 8. And that's the work that we do at ATRI over the course of the next year. Well, one of the tools that we provide to RAC members to identify where there are research needs in the trucking industry is an annual survey of the top industry issues that we started back in 2005. And so this is to identify the top issues of concern in the trucking industry, not just what are the research needs, which is what the RAC identifies, but this is what are the issues which are impacting your business on a day-to-day basis. As I said, we started in 2005. Each year that we've done the survey since then, participation in the survey has grown. We have increased not only the number of motor carriers and fleet executives who participate in the survey, but also the number of professional drivers who participate in the survey. And so back in the 2016 report, that was the first year where we not only presented the top 10 issues and how they ranked and the strategies for dealing with each, but we broke out the responses by motor carrier respondents and driver respondents because sometimes those two groups see the issues very differently, and it's very telling in terms of how motor carriers address their workforce when drivers view an issue differently than, say, they do. For instance, a classic case in point, truck parking. The industry in general recognizes that truck parking, the lack of available safe truck parking is an issue. In the 2019 survey, truck parking was the number 5 issue overall. But when you look at how drivers rank truck parking, drivers who experience that lack of truck parking every day, they rank it higher. It was number 3 on their list. It had been number 2 before that. So it's important for the industry to understand, one, collectively how they view these issues, but number 2, how the two constituent groups view them differently and how we should approach each issue based on those rankings.
So talk to us a little bit about the issues, the top issues survey, and really what you've seen it morph into. It's become really kind of the go-to survey that everybody looks at. Talk to us about what you've seen it morph into, and how have you best seen it utilized to help carriers make decisions moving forward in their business?
Well, it's interesting because when you look back at the very first year we did this survey in 2005, and you compare some of the top 10 issues from that survey to the top 10 issues in the 2019 survey, you see some differences, but you see a lot of the same issues. For instance, in 2005, the number one issue was fuel costs. Well, when I think back to what was going on, and we always launched this survey late summer, that was hurricane season. That was the year of Katrina, as well as a number of other pretty impactful hurricanes that were impacting the Gulf fuel supply. And we were seeing diesel prices increase as a result of that. So fuel cost was the issue that everybody was feeling the pain of right then. I think diesel was well up over $3, maybe even $3.50 a gallon. So everybody was feeling the pain of fuel costs. So that was the number one issue in 2005. The driver shortage was the number two issue. 2005 was number two, 2019, it was the number one issue. And so collectively, you know, the industry has, and the driver shortage, with the exception of during the Great Recession, the driver shortage has been in the top five ever since. And so it's an issue that stays with us, but it is an issue that each year the strategies differ somewhat for how we deal with that issue. Now, in 2005, the number one strategy that the industry ranked for dealing with the driver shortage was to increase driver compensation. Fast forward to the 2019 survey, driver compensation is its own standalone issue, coming in at number three. Now, I mentioned that we had increased the participation of professional drivers over the years, and so you might say to yourself, well, it's not surprising driver compensation came in at number three overall because all the drivers voted for it. And that is true that a lot of drivers did select it as a top issue for themselves. But when we looked at the survey responses, a number of motor carriers also ranked driver compensation as a top concern. And I think, Tom, in large part, that's driven by the fact that because of the driver shortage, so many fleets had been increasing driver pay and driver benefits. And there was concern as to how sustainable those increases would continue to be, particularly if something like fast forward to 2020, the pandemic hits us and freight volumes drop off in certain sectors, and it's very difficult, obviously, to walk back someone's pay. And so, you know, how do you adjust your operational costs to deal with those higher wages? So it's just one of those issues that, you know, I like to say the more things change, the more they stay the same sometimes. So how do we use the results of the survey? Well, beyond what the Research Advisory Committee members like yourself do to look at the survey results to identify where we need to be doing additional research, motor carriers use it to better understand how their drivers feel about the issues. And so, for instance, on the issue of truck parking that I mentioned, overall it was number five, but for drivers it was number three. You might say, well, what can a motor carrier do about the lack of truck parking? Well, first, it's important to understand that it is such an important issue for your drivers. But two, there are things you can do. You can work with your state DOTs. Motor carriers can work through their state trucking associations and with their state departments of transportation to emphasize how important it is to do things like keep rest areas open and keep that capacity in the system. Like we saw early on in the pandemic, states were shutting their rest areas, effectively taking capacity out of the truck parking system at a time when we really needed it. And so, you know, it's a very useful tool. The results of the survey are a very useful tool for national associations and state trucking associations to use to understand what the industry cares about and what the industry believes they should be doing about those issues. But it has application for motor carriers as well.
So I'm going to ask you the question that no data-driven researcher would ever want to answer. With COVID and 2020 being such a bizarre year, what is your best guesses on what's going to happen with these top industry issues for 2020, knowing all the past research that you've seen on this? I mean, what do you see changing in this moving forward?
Well, it's interesting because I'm fairly certain and I'd even probably go on record and say the driver shortage will not be the #1 issue in 2020. I think we will easily see the economy, which came in at number 10 in the 2019 survey. I think we'll see the state of the nation's economy go way up in the ranking. But some issues didn't disappear just because of the pandemic. Truck parking is one of those. When we did some survey work with OIDA early on in the pandemic, we asked survey respondents, and we had over 5,000 of them in that survey, is truck parking easier or harder to find during this pandemic period? And a plurality of drivers said it is much harder to find parking, again, pointing to probably those closing of rest areas. So I'm not sure an issue like truck parking is going to disappear. What I do think will show up, however, are driver health related issues, and specifically related to the concerns that drivers have, particularly when we have an older driver population for whom we know are more susceptible to COVID. I think we'll see driver health and wellness issues go up higher in the ranking. We'll see the economy go up. We now have from FMCSA a new fix, or a new hours of service rule. So it was #2 on the survey. I think it will drop way down, I would suspect. And it might likely be replaced by something COVID related.
Well, let's move on to that. Let's talk a little bit about the hours of service rule. Obviously, something that has been top of mind. Y'all have done a ton of research on the hours of service rule. So why don't you walk the viewers through those pieces of research that you've done and then stuff that you're working on moving forward.
Yeah, there was a time when I called the hours of service rules the ATRI Full Employment Act, because it seemed like the rules were changing every few years, therefore giving us a new set of rules to study the impacts from. And so our portfolio in that area is quite extensive, going back as far as the first change we got to the rules in over 60 years. That came about in 2003 and went into effect in 2004. And that was the first change that brought us the 34-hour restart. It reduced it increased the driving hours from 10 to 11. It reduced the on-duty time from 15 to 14. And so we collected a large amount of carrier and driver data to study the impact of that specific change. And so we took safety performance data from 2003 and safety performance data from 2004. So under the old rules, under the new rules. And what we found is those changes had very positive impacts for the industry in terms of reduced crashes, reduced driver injuries, reduced driver injuries that came from crashes. So overall injuries for drivers were down. So things like getting in and out of my truck were reduced, which we hypothesized was because drivers were less fatigued operating under these newer hours of service rules. So that was really good work and really documented in a data-driven way how those hours of service rules had a very positive impact. I'm sorry, my dog is deciding to scratch her pen. You hear that? So then fast forward to subsequent legal challenges to the rules and rules changes. And in 2013, we knew that we were going to get a new set of hours of service rules that were going to impact primarily the 34-hour restart, and going to require that if a driver was going to use that 34-hour restart, he or she would have to have 2 overnight periods where the rest covered 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. And everyone knew that was going to be impactful. And so the first study we did in 2013 was really to evaluate what the agency, FMCSA, said the impacts from that rule would be versus what we believed, based on a review of over 40,000 driver logbooks, what we believed the impacts would be. And we found a fairly significant delta between the savings that the agency had predicted the industry would experience versus what we believe the industry would cost. In fact, that delta on an annual basis was about $322 million between the savings that the industry projected and the costs that ATRI estimated the industry would experience. So really calling into question that regulatory impact analysis that had been done on those rules. Fast forward to November of 2013, we're operating under those new hours of service rules, and we did a second data collection we again looked at that same data set of 40,000 logbooks now of drivers operating under these new 34-hour restart provisions, and found some very telling features. First of all, drivers were reporting more fatigue, reduced quality of life, reduced earning, all because of that requirement that you get that 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. rest period. We also found increased traffic using our truck GPS data set. We found increased traffic during the daytime because truck drivers were now getting on the road at 5 a.m. when everybody else is starting their morning commute. And when trucks are involved around more cars, have greater exposure to car drivers, you see crash rates go up. In fact, daytime hours, according to FMCSA's own data, are the riskiest for truck drivers because of that exposure to car drivers. So we saw increases in property damage only crashes, injury crashes, not as much in the fatal crashes, because when you're stuck in traffic, it's harder to have those real severe crashes, but just some real negative findings from those changes. And as you know, Tom, Congress heard, the agency heard, and we subsequently eliminated that requirement for that 1 a.m. to 5 a.m. And then our latest hours of service study looked at the potential for economic savings for the industry and operational cost savings and productivity increases if drivers were allowed flexibility in the sleeper berth provision. And as you know, this latest change now does in fact allow for some additional flexibility there. So I'm very proud of our entire portfolio of hours of service work. I'm very proud of the work that the Research Advisory Committee has done in directing that research and saying these are topics we need to look at because it really does help us move the needle as an industry to get to a safer regulatory framework. And that's an important part of what we do here at ATRI.
So is there plans, because of the most recent hours of service changes, there are plans for some further research to be done, taking a look at maybe those 40,000 logbooks again to see what the impact of this latest decision is going to be?
Right, and of course that will be a decision our Research Advisory Committee will make, but the great feature is now, looking at logbook data is a lot easier because we have the ELD mandate. And so that, from a research standpoint, makes things a lot easier for us to address. So we will leave that to the direction of the Research Advisory Committee when they meet in March of 2021.
And then on that, you talked a little bit about the traffic congestion being an issue because of the timing of everything. As you're doing this research, whether it be on hours of service or the traffic, the bottleneck piece, which we'll talk a little bit about here soon, but how do you think that the coronavirus and the lack of traffic, today was actually the first day on my commute into the office that I actually saw significant traffic. And we know the traffic numbers are down. We recently on this show had the Ohio Department of Transportation director on talking about the lack of miles being driven out there. How does that skew your data, and how do you as a researcher anticipate that and make corrections for that?
Well, certainly we have, using our truck GPS data, already documented those the reduced congestion and increased truck speeds as a result of the pandemic. For instance, when we looked at one of the worst truck bottlenecks in the country right here in Atlanta, where I live, Spaghetti Junction, we call it, where 285 and 85 intersect. During a normal rush hour, afternoon rush hour, truck speeds average at that location about 14 to 15 miles per hour. It's posted at 55. During the pandemic, same week in March, we looked at it this year, and truck speeds were averaging 54, 55 miles per hour. So we do know everybody else stayed home, trucks had the road. So it is going to have an impact on our annual bottleneck analysis. And we've got a challenge at ATRI to figure out how we take a full year of 2020 data and effectively evaluate the top truck bottlenecks, because we had bottlenecks before the pandemic hit and they're coming back, as you mentioned today in your commute. So we are seeing the traffic come back. Is it a case where for the 2020 data, we just carve out a 5-month period and don't include that in the analysis? Are there some opportunities and I think are there some opportunities to show how much more efficient the supply chain can be when trucks have the infrastructure they need? Because that's effectively what we had during the pandemic. We had the infrastructure we needed to be able to get the job done. And so we have a bottleneck summit that we're going to have at the staff level just to talk about these issues and really how we're going to evaluate that data. I mean, you know, you've got in Ohio, one of the top 10 truck bottlenecks on our most recent list. It's at number 8 on the list. In Cincinnati, where 71 and 75 intersect. And so, you know, what happened at that location during the pandemic? Traffic was down. Congestion's not nearly going to be what it was, but it will return.
Well, yeah, and that'll be interesting research to be done, because I think a lot of people take a look at the Brent Spence Bridge as, you know, you're going uphill both ways, coming out of it and heading north, and coming out of it heading south. You know, what's the impact of that of that traffic, as opposed to just the mere, you know, geography and topography of that area, of trying to get those large trucks, you know, back up a hill, to see what sort of impact that has. So that'd be, you know, that'll be kind of interesting piece to take a look at.
Well, and you know, it's interesting because, you know, if there are silver linings to the pandemic, for instance, number 3 on our list this year was a location in Nashville. Well, that location rose up quickly to the top 10 and top 5 on the top truck bottleneck list because it's been under construction. It was a bad place for trucks. The Tennessee DOT was doing what it needed to do to rebuild that. With the reductions in COVID, we've seen across the country, in many places, construction projects go a lot faster because they're not dealing with as much traffic and having to work around as much traffic. And so, you know, the DOTs and their construction crews are able to get in there and get the work done in a safer environment for them because they don't have as many people driving around them. And so, you know, that's a location, and that was projected to be done this year anyway. That's a location where I think we'll see that one drop way down. Brent Spence Bridge, not necessarily, not under construction, not being redesigned. We have another one in Chicago that is our classic one, the Circle Interchange, Burn Interchange it's called now, that is still under construction, so it's still in the top 10, but that construction is nearing completion. And so, you know, it helps us as we look historically at that bottleneck list to really hone in on what are the places where there's a problem and a consistent problem, so that we can focus our resources on it.
So CSA, as always, the conversion to CSA has been a challenge for the industry, a challenge, I think, for the agency is, you know, how do you convert over to that system? Tell us a little bit about the research you've done there and the impacts of that research that has been on the decision-making process.
Well, of course, we got as an industry CSA in 2010. That was the nationwide rollout of compliance, safety, and accountability, which, you know, for a lot of folks outside the industry was confusing because they thought the rules had changed. The rules didn't change. What changed is how you were evaluated and measured under those same rules. And so one of the first things we looked at, one of the first studies we did, and we were one of the first entities to document this, was a real statistical disconnect between basic scores, how a carrier was scored in those basic areas versus their crash risk. And so really pointing to some underlying issues with the algorithms that were calculating carrier scores. Very well received study, very solid piece of statistical analysis, which was subsequently used by the agency as they started to tweak those weightings of the different violations to more accurately capture crash risk based on basic scores. We also looked at the disparity differences in state enforcement. So your score as a motor carrier could be impacted by where you run your miles. Some states, one of your neighboring states loves to focus on speed. And so if you travel a lot in Indiana, your driver safety or your safety basic would be impacted by your speed violations. Whereas other states, for instance, Texas focuses a lot on vehicle maintenance and lighting. And so your basic scores might not necessarily be reflective of who you are, but where you run. And so we documented that as well. And that was one of the recommendations to come out of the National Academies panel that looked at CSA. They looked at a lot of ATRI's research, And they said, you have to do something to address those state enforcement disparities. And then the last one we did was to look at the lack of crash accountability that goes into the crash basic calculation. So as I always say, in the eyes of FMCSA, a crash was a crash was a crash, regardless of whether the motor carrier was responsible for that crash or not, or could have prevented it, the motor carrier or the driver. And what we found is some fairly significant reductions in carrier crash basic scores when we pulled out some of those crashes. Things like when a truck is legally parked and someone runs into them, or they're legally stopped at a stop sign or a stoplight and someone runs into them. When they are hit by a driver who is under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Again, the professional driver can't do anything to avoid those crashes, nor could the motor carrier. So when we pull those crashes out of their crash basic calculation, we saw some fairly significant reductions in their crash basic scores. FMCSA looked at that research, looked at research that others had done, started a pilot project, as you know, where carriers could submit certain crash types and crashes through the data queues system to be reevaluated. They have now made that permanent. And so I really feel like in the hours of service rules in CSA, our research has over time really moved the needle in improving the industry's regulatory environment.
Yeah, talking about enforcement, the interesting part is I got a call a number of years ago from a reporter asking why Ohio had so many light violations written, and what I had found out through that process is that the motor carrier enforcement folks who are on the road can't write a ticket or pull a truck over for speeding. So the only option they have is a light. So that's why I think Ohio writes more light violations than any other state in the country. So, but yeah, that's what you'll see is most of the people who run in Ohio have, vehicle maintenance issues on CSA because that's what they're writing, regardless of if they find anything else during the inspection piece. So, yeah, great work on CSA. The crash statistic piece is always one that's a challenge for everyone and something that's difficult for, I think, for the industry to stomach as well. Knowing that they were just at the wrong place at the wrong time, and then they get dinged on their score, which has the impacts throughout the system. For the viewers, we are working our way down to the pretty close to the end of our discussion. So if there is any questions that you would have for Rebecca, please throw it in the Q&A. Let's talk a little bit about truck bottlenecks, your favorite topic, If the bottleneck summit has long bottlenecks, I would definitely want to be a part of that, but it's not that kind of bottleneck. So let's talk a little bit about the bottleneck study, which has been something that I think has been an extremely useful resource for, I know, myself and my counterparts on the state level. But let's talk a little bit about where that came from and how that's evolved over time.
Well, going as far back, Tom, as 2002, when we started this work in collecting truck GPS data. And really, I have to give credit to our staff because they really dug in their heels and came up with really effective algorithms for how we treat that truck GPS data. We have a snapping algorithm that snaps the pings in a way that we can tell where the congestion is. And we've really expanded not only our data set, we now have over 1 million trucks worth of GPS data that comes into us in real time, but expanding the use of that data set, that truck GPS data set. So not only are we able to do the bottleneck analysis, but we do a lot of truck parking work because we can tell where trucks are parking, whether it's legal parking or not. So it helps a state identify, if we're consistently having trucks parked in this location, and it's not a designated truck parking location, maybe it tells us we need to expand rest areas nearby to allow for more truck parking. But the bottleneck analysis was our first really big work in using that truck GPS data set. And for that, we monitor congestion at 300 locations around the country. We've identified those locations working with the Federal Highway Administration, with the state departments of transportation, with you and your peers around the country, with motor carriers, professional drivers. So 300 freight significant locations that we use this GPS data to keep an eye on congestion over the course of a year. And we look at how slowly trucks are operating below the posted speed limit, and we look at how many trucks are impacted. And each year we use those two metrics, volume and speed, to identify the 100 worst places to operate a truck. And so in 2019, I think Ohio had 4 of those top 100 truck bottlenecks. And so, as you mentioned, it's a great tool at the state level for you to work with your DOT and your state legislature to say, you know what, these are the choke points we've got to focus on to improve the industry's productivity and safety, for that matter, because those locations can be more dangerous as well. And at the federal level, it really gives the Federal Highway Administration an idea of where these locations are so that they can, working with the state DOTs, focus resources on it. And when that happens, we see the payoff. I mean, I mentioned the Burn interchange earlier. That was our #1 location for 3 years running when we first started publishing this list, to the point where the state said, you know what, we're going to do something about this. We don't want to have the #1 truck bottleneck in the country. They commissioned a very costly redesign study, and for a number of years now, they have been rebuilding that interchange to ultimately make it more efficient for trucks and cars to get through there.
Yeah, I think Ohio is actually probably a little happy that the Brent Spence Bridge is always in the top 5, in the hopes that Kentucky, who actually owns the bridge, will do something about it. I know like I said on the air on this show, we had the DOT director on the air with us, and he's talked about how they've got a number of different plans in place that are ready to go. They just need to figure out how to pay for it, and that's always the challenge, right? Is how do you undertake such a massive project underneath that? So, Rebecca, we appreciate you being here with us virtually, but you will be with us in person at our annual conference on September 21st and 22nd. So we're looking very much forward to hosting you here in Ohio. I will tell everyone we had our Driver of the Year banquet on Friday, went off absolutely flawlessly, very socially distanced and very well taken care of. I think I went through an entire bucket of sanitizing wipes on the microphone every time I handed it off to somebody else. But give the viewers a little bit of a flavor of what they can expect to hear at the annual conference when you present.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it. And one of the study's newest ATRI releases I'm going to talk about is a very in-depth study we conducted on nuclear verdicts. And when we use that term nuclear verdicts, we're looking at verdicts over $10 million. But we, to do that research, pulled together a database of 600 plus legal cases and verdicts in truck-involved crash cases. And we looked at everything from the frequency and size of these verdicts to the type of injuries that were sustained in these crashes and what that meant for the average verdict size. We did a number of in-depth interviews with both defense attorneys and plaintiff attorneys to really hone in on what works and what doesn't and what needs to be improved in the system, and how motor carriers, real practical advice for how motor carriers can mitigate their likelihood of being part of one of these nuclear verdicts. So a lot of great findings to talk through with the attendees at your conference, and I'm looking forward to being there.
Yes, and so that is a great piece, but can you also give us some flavor as well as to some of the research that y'all are undertaking right now that would be useful for our viewers to know?
Absolutely. We are in the middle of our annual operational costs of trucking data collection. We've been doing this one since 2008, Tom, and as you know, we collect very detailed financial information from hundreds of motor carriers. We aggregate, analyze it, and come up with an average cost per mile to operate a truck. It is a fabulous benchmarking tool for motor carriers, and so I'll share with the attendees at the conference some of the findings from that research because it's important for you as a motor carrier to understand how, for instance, your vehicle maintenance costs compare to your peers overall, but your peers in your sector of the industry. So in the report, we break it out by truckload, less than truckload, specialized carriers, even tank truck operators. You can also compare how your driver wage and benefit costs stack up against your peers. How frequently are you turning over your equipment? Are you holding on to it longer than the average industry? So a lot of just really great operational data in that report that I'll talk about at the conference, but I would also encourage your members, now is the time to participate in ATRI's 2020 data collection for that. the data collection forms available on our website, as is all of our research, at truckingresearch.org, and we do hope that they will participate.
And most definitely, that was a valuable piece. I remember when I was working for the trucking company that I worked for, we definitely used that as the basis for not only operational costs, but like you said, driver pay, because we were in the midst of doing that. And definitely the body of work that ATRI produces is absolutely amazing. So please, as the viewers and you're talking with people, just ask them if they filled out the ATRI information, and go there yourself and take the time to fill it out, because it's invaluable. I had a professor that I took my marketing research classes from who said, if you don't fill out surveys, you have no right to complain about anything, because the only way that people can get better is if they have that data in front of them. So like I said, your body of work is available on your website. It's all free of charge, because ATRI is a 501c3. So I would definitely encourage and strongly encourage any of the viewers to make sure that they go and donate to ATRI and the fine work that they do. The Ohio Trucking Association is a donor, and we are very proud to be able to support that. But being able to provide this support that ATRI needs to do this great work is vital to making sure that the industry is well represented and well researched, because we live in a data-driven society and decisions don't get made without data. So Rebecca, thank you so much for the work you do, and thank your staff for the work that they do. And thank you for the opportunity to serve on the Research Advisory Committee. Little sad that my reign is over in that regard, but it was an absolutely great experience. So thank you very much. Appreciate it, and we will see you in September at our annual conference.
Looking forward to it. Thanks, Tom, for having me on today.
Great, thanks. We'll see you all in 2 weeks when we will have Steve Bryant, who will be another one of our speakers at our annual conference on the show. Thank you all.